meaning that musicians and ensembles have been unable to rehearse and perform together for months, and it's not clear when live performances will resume. In fact, one must ask, will there even be an appetite amongst audiences to support live music, especially as many patrons are older and perhaps more vulnerable? It's not to say this lockdown has been all bad. There have been some amazing examples of innovation over the past few months, sometimes bringing together many musicians onto the same digital platform who might not otherwise have shared the same physical stage. And there's also been an incredible amount of engagement between artists and audiences, from the intimacy of inviting your audience inside your living room and conversing with them during a performance in real time, all the types of events that have been made possible as part of this program, Fane Arts Select. And perhaps that's something we can discuss a little bit later. But unfortunately, on the scale of hazardous activities, singing is about as bad as it gets. Singers and their audiences are at a particularly high risk of contracting the virus, as singing, and especially powerful singing, which engages the diaphragm, produces aerosols, which are very small drops of saliva and that may contain viable virus and that can hang in the air for some time. These droplets may spread at a rapid rate and across large distances. And we're all advised, as you know, to wear masks to reduce the spread of virus. And remember that a vocal task like singing, which can produce smaller particles than coughing, say, those could pose an immediate risk to those nearby. And there have been several cases of choirs that have been affected. You've probably heard about the tragic story of the choir from Washington State in the USA. There was one singer there who was asymptomatic at the time of the rehearsal, but they ended up infecting something like 45 out of the 60 other singers, even though safety precautions such as hand sanitizer and refraining from hugs and handshakes were in place. And so this embargo on hosting rehearsals and live performances is especially tough for us as Vox, as our main focus as a choral group is live performances and a very intimate connection with our audience. Now, over the past 5 years, we've hosted dozens of performances, some in traditional spaces such as here at the Baxter Concert Hall and churches around Cape Town. We started singing in 2015 to continue the choral legacy of the St. George's Singers, which had been led for over 50 years by Barry Smith. Now, we like to do things quite differently from other choirs. For example, we've pioneered a multisensory wine and music pairing at Fruit Constantia, and also immersive experiences in which we've taken our audience on a journey to the Northern Lights. Earlier this year, we performed 2 concerts in the dark, in which our audience was encouraged to wear blindfolds. This was back when masks for the eyes were more popular than masks for the mouth and the nose. But all this experiential stuff is hard to replicate online, because without the atmosphere, the live music, and the full immersion that you as an audience member would experience, and it's not just that, it's also for us as singers, it's about the psychological and emotional aspects of choral singing, those intangible, fleeting feelings of connectedness when one is singing together, seeing one's musical family every week, sharing experiences, breathing together. We hope that we might be able to meet together later this year for a performance, circumstances permitting, but of course we have to be responsible and not put ourselves or our audience at risk. Now, one way of getting around this, at least in the short term, is through the medium of a virtual choir. And this has been made very popular by the American composer Eric Whitacre. There you can see him, the poster boy of contemporary choral music. And he's done an amazing job cultivating an enthusiasm and interest in choral music, especially amongst youngsters. And in a virtual choir, each singer records his or her own part alone at home. And then all those individual voice parts are stitched together to form the rich choral tapestry. Of course, they all need to sing against the same guide track or maybe follow a conducting video to ensure that they're all synchronized with one another. And so there's a lot of technology and work behind the scenes that then brings all these tracks together and makes them sound pleasing. Now, Eric Whitacre's virtual choir projects have attracted thousands of singers from all over the world, and he has an enormous following. His latest project attracted something like over 17,000 participants from dozens of countries, and the final performance will be released next month, so look out for that. I'd like to start this presentation off with a bit of an exercise. I'm going to play a piece of music for you, and I'd like you to guess whether this is a real recording of Vox or whether this is virtual Vox. In other words, did we record the pieces together as a choir or apart? I guess the real question is, can you tell the difference? And I realize some of you have already seen this online, so please don't tell. The piece is from the 16th century. It was written by an English composer, Thomas Tallis, and the words are taken from the Bible. And we've designed a short video to accompany this recording.
If ye love me, keep my commandments, and I will bring upon and he shall teach you.
And so we thought that the gentle mood of that piece, plus the fact that it was composed during a time of great turmoil in England during the Renaissance, was appropriate for this time of lockdown. So that was, in fact, a virtual choir recording, our first exploration of the virtual choir medium. And while it's by no means an ideal replacement for singing together, it gave us an opportunity to learn a lot of lessons and also brought to the fore some reasons why digital projects such as this can never replace the act of real singing and performing together, but can still provide meaningful musical activity during this time, both for our singers and our audiences. And so it's some of these lessons and observations that we've learned along the way that I hope to share with you today in three broad areas: the planning and the technical, and then the musical challenges that we faced. So at the very beginning, we faced the question of how do we convince our singers to participate in this project? Normally, as the conductor, I'm the one who makes the musical decisions, obviously taking into account particular suggestions or maybe requests that have been made. And then I propose the projects for the year. But of course, things have now changed dramatically. This, singing in lockdown, wasn't what the singers had signed up for. And even though that first project I just played for you, which we did very early on in the lockdown, that wasn't for everybody. Above all, we are a choir, but we're a community. And early on in the lockdown, we realized that we had a responsibility to both our singers and supporters to be there for them and to provide support where possible. And so once we suspended our face-to-face gatherings and the lockdown began, we met weekly on Zoom, this very same digital platform, to provide that sense of community if singers chose to join us, which generally they did, and also to provide support and a sense of routine. And then we also reached out to our audience, especially those whom we suspected might be vulnerable at this time, to offer support and assistance to them. And so bearing in mind that this prohibition on singing was likely to last for some months, we decided to take a consultative approach in which we spent a few weeks on Zoom together with our singers, and gave them a platform to express what they wanted to get out of the group during this time. And we hope that this would allow them to feel engaged with the process. And the overwhelming response was enthusiasm to continue with these kinds of virtual choir projects. And while there were some reservations, not musically satisfying for some, or some who disliked listening back to themselves, there was acknowledgement that this was still a meaningful way to come together and to make beautiful music. Now, instead of learning new music, we decided to focus on looking back and celebrating some of our past highlights, the music we've explored over the last 5 years, much of which we haven't recorded. And we ran a survey online to find out which music our singers most enjoyed over the years. We all agreed, for example, it would be preferable to sing nothing too technically challenging, to sing music that was beautiful and harmonious. And then I would use that as a guideline to decide which pieces we should do. And so for me, as a conductor, taking this virtual approach to the music, at least for a limited time, does have some positives. For example, rather than squeezing in many pieces in preparation for a live performance, we could now focus on maybe one a month and devote a full evening to understanding the context of the piece, the composer, the words, listening to recordings together, and so on. Because, as you will know, music is not just singing together, it's also about communication, about understanding the piece and the composer's intention, and all are important aspects of conveying the music successfully. And above all, it would be excellent preparation in case we are able to perform in person later this year, as everyone would then be familiar with the music. So that would still be first prize for us, is to then have a live performance of all these virtual choir projects we prepared for towards the end of the year. So how does one actually go about, on a sort of technical level, putting together a virtual choir? And here's an example of the piece on which we are currently working. It's called Stars. It's by a Latvian composer, Eric Essenvalds. And we first performed this piece at one of our first major concerts in 2016, and again the following year, but we never recorded it. And so this felt like a good opportunity to tackle the piece again. It also uses, unusually, tuned wine glasses, which would be played by the singers in performance. And you can see that in the picture below from our 2016 performance. And that really gives the whole atmosphere of the piece a very ethereal and otherworldly sound. So the first thing one needs to do now is set up a template track or a guide track for the singers to follow in their homes. Initially, we used a MIDI playback file, but this wasn't ideal. It wasn't satisfying to sing against. There was no visual element or no conductor. The singers said they felt less engaged. It was very rigid in terms of the tempo changes. So what we've done now is engage with a professional, Grant McLaughlin, and he and I work together on a particular interpretation that I'm happy with. Normally, it's easiest for me to find a recording I like the most and then to suggest a few changes to mold it in a way I'm happy with. He then produces a piano backing, which is very expressive, and the attack of a piano sound is preferable to, say, synthetic MIDI voices, which are less clear. And so this piano attack helps to keep everyone better in time and also in tune. And I'll give you an example in just a minute. Grant also included a click track to the piano backing, so that the rhythm or the tempo of the piece was very clear to all the singers. And initially I was against the click track, as I felt that this would detract from the musical flexibility of the piece, or that would make it too rigid or metronomical. But this needn't be the case, because what I discovered was that this flexibility, what musicians call rubato, so taking a bit of a time here and adding it in later there, one can build that into the click track. And then because the click is clear and relatively predictable, those who are following actually have to guess less and can focus more on precision and more on musical aspects such as timbre and expression. And then finally, I provided a conducting video, as the singers had hoped or mentioned that they would like. And I'd hoped this would then help them to engage more with the emotional aspects of the piece, such as singing more sensitively, as well as extra hints on phrasing and dynamics that the visual cues would provide. So here's an example now of a resource I provide to our singers using Stars, on which we're currently working as an example. And you'll hear the click track, which keeps us all tightly in time. You'll hear the piano backing, which gives us the notes and hence keeps us all in tune, Plus, there's also a human on the other side to remind them of the musical and emotional aspects of the performance. And I'll play about a minute of it to give you an idea. And if you can read music, then you'll also be able to follow in this excerpt from the score. I think we'll leave it there. I always hate having to watch myself after I've recorded something. I guess how singers also don't always enjoy hearing their own voices once they've recorded them. You'll notice in the top left corner that I also provide an annotated score, just to give the singers some extra tips or helpful reminders about where to breathe or which parts ought to be especially expressive, all things that we worked on in an online rehearsal beforehand. So how do the singers go about recording their parts? Typically, they will then watch that video or listen to the click track on its own using one device, such as their computer. They'll be listening through the headphones, and then they'll record using another device, like a cell phone, or it is possible to do both on a cell phone or computer. Now, the piece I played earlier, the motet by Thomas Tallis, that was mainly recorded using cell phone microphones, the same technology you might use for sending voice notes over WhatsApp. And of course, we soon learned that there was a lot of heterogeneity in the files that the singers sent us. And so we've made a list of guidelines for them to take into, tips for them to take into account. For example, keeping a certain distance away from the microphones, they're not too soft nor too loud, in which case the sound would distort. Preferably, they should be sitting in a room with as little reverb or resonance as possible, so the recording is as dry as possible. The backing track to which they're listening to while recording, that shouldn't bleed through the headphones, so it shouldn't come through on their vocal track. And page turn noises and other ambient sounds, you'd be surprised, dogs barking and bird songs, those should be minimized. And the usual good practice of singing the right words and coming off from phrases at the right time is also important. So the singers then email these files through to us, and one of our singers, Kyle Paulson, does his magic by stitching them all together using a free audio software program called Audacity. So here you can see, this is If You Love Me that we heard earlier. You'll see each voice part from the top soprano, then alto, tenor, bass. Each voice part is represented by different colors, and you'll notice that all the waveforms are different from one another. In other words, different things are happening at different times. And that's because of the polyphonic nature of the piece, in which each line is independent from the others. So not everyone is always doing the same thing at the same time. And I have here just a few examples to show you how we bring all these individual tracks together. So the first one is just if I were to import all of these different voice files that have been received from all the singers into a single file and click play. In other words, they haven't been specially aligned or put in the right place. What would that sound like? So that's pretty cacophonous. An interesting 21st century reinterpretation of Tallis, I guess. But if you focus on just the soprano line, for example, and then you add and align the individual voices one by one, what does that sound like?
If you love me, keep my commandments.
once you've done the same alignment activity with all of the other voice parts, alto, tenor, and bass, you can add them all into the same file.
If ye love me, keep my commandments.
And then finally, when you're happy with the alignment, you can start playing with the overall atmosphere and the feel of the piece, perhaps bringing in suitable reverb as well to create an appropriate atmosphere.
If ye love me, keep my commandments.
It doesn't mean it's a purely mechanical process. Along the way, of course, one still needs to make various judgments, like the balance amongst the singers. Will all the voices be equally loud, or do you want to select one or two to be prominent? Which ones? Those voices with a particular quality, or those that are the most expressive? And whatever decision you take, it needs to be consistent then amongst all four of the voice parts in terms of quality, loudness, and so on. Now, a general rule that we learned quite early on was more is better. Having more voice parts gives one much more flexibility in terms of creative choices and also makes it easier to make the sound more homogeneous. In fact, one way of increasing the number of tracks at one's disposal is to ask the singers if they would mind making multiple recordings. For example, they might record their own line twice over, or maybe even 3 times, and then they don't need to worry about creating the perfect track. I mean, because when have you sung a piece absolutely perfectly in every respect? It's very difficult. And it reminds me of a book I'm reading at the moment about the Japanese conductor, Seiji Ozawa. He reflects on the orchestral player's role, especially in late romantic music, music by Mahler, Richard Strauss. And he talks to them about how, if each of them plays their particular lines as beautifully and faithfully to the score as possible, then you cannot help but have an excellent sound overall. And we also ask our singers to play and to experiment, perhaps recording another voice parts track too. And this gives those singers enormous insight into the rest of the music. It's something we don't usually have time for in preparation for a live performance. And then, as I mentioned, once you've put all the voice parts together and you're happy with the general form, you can start playing with dynamics if they're not clear enough already, perhaps making things a bit louder or softer, but not too much. Otherwise, it starts to sound quite artificial. And you can also play with reverb. What's the overall sound picture you're trying to create? Do you want a bigger room or space, like a church or a cathedral, or more clarity and a more immediate sound, like a small hall or a theater? And one can also play with panning, making different voices come from different directions to create a stereo effect. But that's still something we're experimenting with. I think it's very important to point out that we don't necessarily want to make the music perfect. That's something we haven't always liked about other virtual choir projects from other choirs. And such over-polished tracks, like many recordings, can often lead to unrealistic expectations from audiences who are coming to hear live performances, but it can also be discouraging for other choirs who want to give the virtual choir medium a try when you've got this extremely high bar that makes the virtual choir endeavor seem out of reach. So our philosophy has been to try and share our music in a form that's reminiscent of a live performance. And so we've left in occasional slips and breaths, provided they're not too distracting, to bring the music alive. And importantly, once again, we did these kinds of projects as a way of staying engaged with our supporters who've been so generous over the years and who've encouraged us so kindly. And we acknowledge this may be a very challenging time for some of them, many of whom may be vulnerable or alone, and we hope that this virtual music will bring them comfort and hope. So how did our singers react once they heard the final, in inverted commas, performance? I think my favorite comment, wow, we still exist. And I've listed here some of the other comments from our newsletter subscribers as well as on our YouTube channel, and I don't put them here to blow our trumpet, but just to show how this project was so supported or appreciated by our supporters. And I really appreciated this last comment. Brings peace to our hearts. Please continue with virtual music. We need it now more than ever. The third aspect I just want to mention briefly, the first two being the planning and the technical sides of the virtual choir, is the musical aspect. And of course, all of this, like a live performance, is quite subjective and up to the conductor. It depends on the piece you choose, what kind of sound you want, how much post-processing and fine-tuning you want to do, and also the caliber and enthusiasm of your singers. And remember that although you can do a lot to edit the tracks and make them perfect, is this really what you want? Sure, there are probably some small changes you want to make. For example, maybe some technical issues with some of the recordings that you receive, or in the voice acquisition, maybe there's distortion, maybe there are actual mistakes you would prefer to eliminate, words and timing issues. But when reflecting with our singers on the process of putting together a virtual choir, one singer commented, often we as singers are so busy listening to one another that we forget to listen to ourselves. And so even though we are alone, listening as a singer, now that listening more focused on oneself, is still a very important task. Another singer thought that it was great to have something to work towards during lockdown. I loved how the final track came together. And another said, making the recordings was an excellent project, even though it made me feel vulnerable. One of the things I love about Vox is how it always stretches me. Indeed, many of us will understand and appreciate how often the most valuable artistic growth happens when we are in a slightly uncomfortable space. Choosing repertoire is also an important decision. Some pieces lend themselves better to the virtual choir medium than others, such as slower and more gentle pieces like the ones we've heard. Faster or technically challenging pieces have more room for error. They might not come across as convincingly, but it all depends on what you want. It's been a challenging decision for us, though, as Vox, we like to present unconventional repertoire, local, new repertoire, which tend not to be the people pleasers that are doing the rounds at the moment. But of course, there is space for those recordings as well. But at the very least, these projects reminded us of the special value of singing together in the same room with friends, and that's why we're in a choir after all. And of course, the scope for these projects is vast. One can involve other musicians or instrumentalists, not just for the camaraderie of making music together, but also to support them, perhaps financially during this time. Why stop with one choir? One could just as easily involve other groups or choirs, even elsewhere in the world. Geography is no longer a problem. And the sound is only one dimension. What about the accompanying video? Again, I think there's some valuable lessons we can take from this process to our in-person music making program once that resumes. For example, we meet weekly as Vox, so maybe we have one online rehearsal a month to focus on the words, the composer's biography, listening and responding to other recordings, sharing them easily on a digital platform like Zoom, as we're doing right now. Virtual choirs needn't be expensive. Rather, one just needs patience, as it can be very time-consuming. And importantly, and that's why I'm so grateful for the opportunity to give this talk now, we also want to share what we've learned from our limited experience with other groups, so that perhaps they can learn from the pitfalls we've experienced. Maybe they'll be encouraged to give it a try, to create a sense of community amongst their singers during this isolated time, and to keep them in the minds of their supporters, at least until we can get together in person again like this. I hope you'll see there's a good case to be made for the virtual choir medium. It can be a successful way of overcoming at least some of the obstacles of lockdown for a group of singers, to create something beautiful together during this time, to maintain the sense for us, especially of our Vox family, offering continued social cohesion and support when one is otherwise quite isolated, to provide achievable and meaningful goals for our singers, to have something tangible to share with our always very supportive audiences, and to keep us in their minds, at least until they're able to join us again for a live performance. And lastly, it's not just about the music at this time. I should also mention we have a range of more socially focused activities to feed back into the enjoyment of making music with one another, which does, I believe, impact the sound when we sing together. These include listening to music or watching performances together, and then discussing them afterwards to enable singers to let their hair down and also to enjoy one another's company. And we're also planning some singing masterclasses with some local teachers to help keep us in good voice. Of course, we're not the only choir sitting at home during lockdown and learning as we go along. Many Almost all other choirs across the world are in the same boat, and there have been other creative approaches to music making during lockdown, but the reality is that sadly it will be many months until we sing together and perform in person again. In fact, earlier this week, many top British conductors and composers wrote an open letter about the importance of keeping Britain's singing culture alive, and we're no exception in South Africa. We could use more guidance, more support, or even just a friendly listening ear from arts organizations and government to help keep local music alive during this difficult time. Now, I mentioned earlier that we're busy working on our third virtual choir project, that piece called Stars. But I'd like to leave you with the second project that we released last month, and it's a brand new piece of music that we were hoping to premiere for the first time last month, that we commissioned from a local composer and cellist, Hans Hussen. It's called Gebed, or Prayer, and the words are by South African poet, medical doctor, and foodie C. Louis Leipold. And the final lines urge us to keep courage when times are tough. Even the darkest moments are eventually dispersed by the light of dawn.
Hier Frieden ist mein Zauberland, ist uns Werke. Die Bitte für uns Zauberland ist verstärken. Hier für uns hast du es in Summe, die Sache geboren. Hier lernt uns lachen, sie lehrt uns auf Drücken und Kraft. Hier für uns Ruhe in die dunkelste Nacht. Hier für uns in die Sonne.
Mensa Homut. I just need to acknowledge the tireless encouragement and enthusiasm of my musical family, the Vox singers and all their loved ones, and especially Kyle Paulson, who is my main sounding board and so willingly and full of care puts time into stitching the tracks together and bringing virtual Vox alive. If you're interested in what we do, please visit our website and join our mailing list or follow us on social media. We have some very exciting plans for next month to celebrate our 5th anniversary. Some CDs are also on the cards, as well as some more virtual Vox projects to which to look forward. Thank you very much to the Fine Arts team for hosting me today, Mary and Chantal and Caroline for kindly connecting Vox and Fine Arts. It's hard to believe that it's been a year since we came to perform in Hermanus at Buschhoff and Liesen. And lastly, thank you very much for your kind attention. I'd love to hear your thoughts, ideas, and reflections. And with that, I think I'll switch on my video again.
Thank you very, very much indeed. I'm sure that everybody who was there has thoroughly enjoyed a peaceful, comforting, wonderful, and stimulating talk to know how much you're doing to maintain this wonderful music that you're making and the huge difficulties that you're managing to overcome.